Okay, so I was going to touch on this subject last week. Thought it would be a little bit different and an interesting subject to focus on. I want to discuss briefly the difference between complaining and whinging, in my opinion. I should emphasize, in my opinion, I'm not really pontificating here. That's not the intention. It is just solely how I feel about it. So, we all know that the modern world is a stressful place. Obviously, some people have a more stressful life than others. If you're working in a financial sector of a big city in London, New York City, Shanghai, Tokyo, the chances are you're going to have a very high paced, fast life. If you are, I don't know, a vineyard owner in the south of France, maybe not so much. Maybe that's not the best example. I don't know. But anyway, the point I'm making is regardless of what your background is, the modern world can be a stressful place. Um, and what I find, this isn't really connected to the video, but I'll just say it quickly. It is interesting that the number of monks and nuns in this country has declined. So whether that is a rejection of that sort of peaceful life, and people actually like the fast pace, or whether it's just a more secular society, I don't know. But that's an interesting side note that there is a decline in Christian monks and nuns. Anyway, in this modern world, it is absolutely inevitable that not everything goes smoothly. So, for instance, let's say you are in an urban life, you're in a big city, or even not such a big city. I mean, I live in Sunderland in the northeast of England. It's not a particularly big city, it's still urban, but it's not particularly big. Um, and I can tell you that in any given year, if I go out, let's say once every 3 or 4 days, um, I'm not in work at the moment. So if I go out every few days, when you deal with sort of daily interaction, there is always a likelihood that things might not go to plan. For instance, let's say you're getting a metro ticket and the machine doesn't work, so you have to then use alternative methods. Let's say you're in a shop and someone gives you the wrong change. Let's say you forget something. There's any number of things that can go wrong. And when you're in another country, it can be more complex because you don't know what the standard procedure is. And it may be that you're not that proficient in the language. I had this experience last year when I was in Dusseldorf, in Germany. And I had a problem that the train was cancelled, not just delayed, but outright cancelled. And that was one of the most stressful nights of my life, going from kiosk to kiosk. Thankfully, there were a few kind people who were trying to help out. Other passengers, I might add, not so much staff. Um, there was an American guy who had some German and a British girl who knew some German. Well, she was British German. They were very helpful. But nevertheless, nothing took away from the fact that it was a very stressful night. I went to about four different kiosks telling me different information. Then when it finally came to time to get the replacement bus, no one bothered to say where exactly that was. It was a very long, stressful night, and this was very cold as well. It was around this time of year. Very uncomfortable night, and unfortunately, it did sour my experience of what was otherwise a nice city. I like Dusseldorf. It's especially around along the Rhine. It has some beautiful views. Great big Ferris wheel, which has great views over the city. That's the old part of the city, incidentally. But the point I'm making is that in life, things don't always go smoothly, and it's what I would call a human factor. With the best will in the world, there will always be a human factor where things go wrong. It could be that someone's had a long day at work and they just can't be bothered with dealing with the public. It could be that you've had a long day at work and you can't be bothered with dealing with transport hassles. Now, I think transport is one of the main areas where things could go wrong, but it could also be in the postal service. So a letter hasn't arrived. You've sent the letter and it hasn't arrived. There's a range of daily things that can go wrong. Now, this is what I want to talk about. What is the difference between complaining and whinging? I think the difference lies in what is acceptable in terms of being assertive. So, I don't agree with those who say sometimes, for example, you go on the forums, transport forums, and people say, "Oh, all you're doing is whinging." But I am a strong believer in consumer rights. So I believe if you pay for something, you have a right to expect a decent service. Without dwelling too much on this, there is quite a lot of people do not like the Tyne and Wear metro service. That's where I live. Um, it seems to have an excess number of problems, and they are constantly putting the price up every year when the service itself doesn't seem to be greatly improving. I think that gets under people's skin because people don't mind paying for a service that is efficient, but the Tyne and Wear metro is not particularly efficient. When they make a mistake, instead of compensating the customer, because they have this 15-minute rule, so if you're 15 minutes late, they don't really care. Doesn't matter if you're late for a job interview because they messed up. They're not going to reimburse you for that. But if you evade the fare, then you'll be fined and possibly dragged before a court. So I think that those sort of double standards get on people's nerves. Um, and there is other much bigger systems, such as the London Underground, which certainly has problems. But I would argue, and I've used the tube a number of times, it is a much better service given that it is a much busier service. Um, so it's those sort of things that can work people up. I do believe in consumer rights. I do believe that when you're paying for a service, it's not whinging to expect a good service. Just it's not a sort of vacuous or pointless complaining. It has a purpose. Because if I take the view that if you don't complain when something is wrong, nothing's ever going to change. Because if people sort of pretend that they're completely happy about a service, well, firstly they can't turn around and then say, "Oh, but we weren't listened to." And it's sort of the same principle with politics, actually. I take this view that people can't complain about canvassers and then at the same time say, "Oh, politicians never listen." So if political activists knock on your door and ask you, "What are you concerned about?" you can't really complain that, "Oh, they're disturbing us," and then say, "Oh, politicians never listen," if you don't give them the opportunity to listen. See what I mean? So I think I believe that people have to be assertive enough to complain when they are being treated unfairly. And as a consumer, I believe that you have the right to expect value for money. I don't think that's whinging. I don't think it's being petty. I think it is. I think if people don't do it, the service continues to be bad. Nothing changes. So I do think there is a place for complaining. Now, what is the difference between that and just outright whinging? I think whinging is when you don't take into account other circumstances. Say, for example, there has been vandalism on a track line. That's something that is not the fault of the metro staff. Now, in that circumstance, it may make the train delayed for 10, 15 minutes. In that circumstance, or say you're stuck at a station, I think people need to be open minded. So, in those circumstances, I would say people are just whinging. If they're complaining in those circumstances, that comes more under the category of whinging. Or if you have someone who's maybe a little bit spoiled for whatever reason, maybe their parents spoiled them, um, there could be a situation whereby they always expect everything to go their way, and it could be that they're not grateful for things that they get. Now, perhaps I'm going into a slightly different realm with this, but I find that people also need to be flexible. The fact of the matter is that in an organized society, people do their jobs, and most jobs are public sector jobs, so most jobs are involving working with the public. And in those circumstances, we expect the people, whether it be metro staff or people working in a cinema, to be as efficient, or a coffee shop to be as efficient as possible. But we have to put ourselves in their shoes. Um, Everyone has testing moments at work. Most jobs, certainly I've had testing moments in my teaching background. I think empathy goes a long way, but also assertiveness. So it's about understanding that people are not robots. There is a human factor. People have long days. Um, and sometimes things just don't go to plan. I remember I was in the Paris metro. I keep mentioning metros, but I think they are a prominent example. And the machine was broken. There was absolutely nothing I could do about it. In fact, the station, I believe, was close. So I literally had to run across the city. I wasn't going to take a taxi because I couldn't afford it at the time. But I literally had to run across the city to the Gare du Nord station. I believe I was at not Montmartre, possibly Montparnasse, somewhere like that. But I literally had to run across the city. I had about 50 minutes or something, and of course I was late and I missed the train. That was another long night, but that's a situation that isn't really anyone's fault. It wasn't my fault because I was well on time to the metro station. It just I didn't know that the machine was going to be broken. Um, Perhaps it was the fault of the Paris Metro for not putting some sort of notification in place. There was no notification even in French. Um, I don't know. I personally believe that when it comes to transport, the thing that customers want most of all is information, information, information. You know, most people I find are quite tolerant and patient, but when they don't get information, that's when tempers fray. Anyway, I don't. To sum up, I don't agree that you should always kind of keep silent and not be assertive and not complain about things. I believe that if you don't complain, you're not being assertive and you're not going to kind of, and this isn't just in terms of transport, this is also in terms of situations. For example, if you've been cheated now in China, I happen to be cheated on a number of occasions. And it's always more of a challenge when you're in another country not proficient in the language. My Chinese skills are, they're elementary at best. They're not really not wonderful. I'm not a complete novice. I do know some Chinese, but certainly not proficient enough to form a comprehensive argument. And I did feel quite aggrieved by that and quite pissed off because they were blatantly doing it because I was a foreigner. There's situations like that where, but you know, even it can happen in your home country. I have been cheated in the UK as well. And it's unfortunate that there are cynical people out there who don't care about others, and they will do that. They're just selfish, unpleasant people, and they don't care about others. But that is the world that we live in, and I find that standing your ground takes time. Not everyone has the ability to just stand up for themselves. Sometimes it does take time. I admit that I'm more assertive now than I used to be. When I was younger, I was sometimes not really a pushover, but if I had a choice of confrontation or walking away, I would choose walking away. That's something that has changed. I have been more assertive, and I have said, "No, look, you've made a mistake." And the thing is, it's about being getting a balance. So you can be polite but be assertive, polite but firm. Excuse me, I think you've made a mistake. And you know, it's I would say that we have to accept the modern world is not robotic. Organized societies are as organized as they can be. Things do go wrong. I mean, you know, take Dusseldorf, for instance. We always hear about German efficiency. Well, that was a very inefficient night. So, the point I'm making is in the modern world, things will go wrong. With the best will in the world, it doesn't matter. Even in the most developed countries, things go wrong. And sometimes that really is just beyond our control, and we have to just accept that it is part and parcel of the modern world. But there's other times I think we do have to be assertive and just say, no, that's not fair. I'm not going to accept that. But whinging, I think whinging comes under the bracket of nothing's good enough. Um, Sometimes I think you get people who, I think I have this thing about eating out. Perhaps it's just me. I'm not a picky eater. I can eat almost anything. And I'm pretty easy to please when it comes to food. But I do notice, I remember when I was a waiter, of course I couldn't say this because you couldn't say it to the customer. But I remember I used to be disheartened when I would see people order what I would consider a perfectly decent meal, then they would waste three quarters of it. And I think in some cases they felt they were somehow being polite. My logic is simple. If you don't think you're going to eat all of it, then don't order all of it. Just seems like a waste. Of course, I would never have said that to the customer, but it's how I felt. And I felt awful having to scrape it into the bin when I knew, well, wait a second, there's homeless people who could be eating this. It's perfectly good food. There's nothing wrong with it. So that made me uncomfortable. So I think when it comes to food, some people can just be whingers and they're very fussy. And I'm not talking about people who have religious obligations or allergies. My younger sister has severe allergies, so I'm very sympathetic to that. Or certain health problems. I'm talking about people who just are hard to please. And I think that comes more into the bracket of whinging. Now, to be fair, some of them know that and they say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a fussy eater. Now, if they're upfront about it, well, at least they're acknowledging it. But some people kind of think that it's other people's problem. Like the whole world should cater for them. Oh, I'm a fussy person and you should accept that. Well, I don't know about that. I take the view, unless it's a religious obligation or an allergy or a health problem, I don't have much sympathy. Not in a world where people are starving to death. That's my own view. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. Let me know what you think. What is the difference between complaining and whinging? I think there is a difference. Incidentally, I'll add one more category to the politics. I have no objection to people complaining about a specific policy. I too, personally, I take a dim view of people making sweeping statements like, "Oh, all politicians are the same. It's all terrible." Blah blah blah. To me, that comes under whinging. Either say something constructive, suggest what you would do alternatively if you were elected, or by all means complain about a specific policy. But I don't like sweeping statements. I don't like people just saying, "Oh, it's all the same and it's all terrible." That's not helping anyone. That isn't helping politicians to do a better job. It's only making their job harder by, throwing stones at them. And I really do believe that. By all means, complain about a specific policy area because that could be affecting you. For example, I've been very vocal about welfare, the Tory approach to that, but I never outright dismiss them as, oh, I would never say something like Theresa May's useless. Why? Because she is in a very difficult job, and I know that. And I don't think, as members of the public, it helps anyone by just throwing stones at politicians. You could be constructive. You could say, I don't like this policy and the Tories are making a big mistake, or it's immoral. I hate this policy and they're wrong about it, or something like that. But just saying they're useless or, it's all terrible, to me, that just is not constructive. I really do believe that. And maybe I'm in the minority, but that's how I feel. Anyway, I'll round this up. Let me know how you feel. What, in your opinion, is the difference between complaining and whinging? I believe everyone has responsibility. Certain things, obviously, as consumers, there's only so much we can do. I do think that consumers have rights, but I also think consumers need to be understanding, and there's certain contexts where they need to understand the situation, like the example I gave about vandalism on the metro line, or indeed a suicide on the metro line. In those circumstances, I think people need to be adaptable. Also, like Black Friday sales, I think it's a terrible idea. It just brings out yobbery in people. But in those circumstances, I really, really feel sorry for the staff that have to put up with that. Or indeed in an airport, a flight's been cancelled, people decide to take it out on the airline staff. I think that's unfortunate. Obviously, people have come to the end of their tether. They might, everyone only has so much patience. I could personally consider myself quite a patient person, but everyone has a red line. But what I don't agree with is people yelling in the face of an airline assistant and sometimes using aggression. I think that's wrong. Um, Airport staff need to have tough skin. They need to know that they are dealing with these situations. But by the same token, there's no excuse for drunken yobs to yell in their face, which unfortunately does happen occasionally. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for watching, and let me know your thoughts. What's the difference between complaining and whinging?